Well, Michael Lewis, welcome back to Fresh Air. What made you want to get into these government departments and see them from the inside here as the transition in administrations occurred?
Well, my mind when Trump was elected was on the subject of risk because I just finished a book, The Undoing Project, about people's the difficulty people had processing risk and evaluating risk. And I was wondering what risks Trump brought with him. I then saw that the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration basically didn't happen. that what normally happens after a new president comes in is that the day after the election, dozens of people roll into each of the agencies and start getting briefings from the people who are on their way out or from the career civil servants. And across the government, there were people waiting inside the Department of Energy or the Department of Agriculture, and no one showed up to be briefed. What are the risks to the society if the government is neglected or mismanaged or misunderstood?
Right. And so you talk to a lot of officials and former officials of these departments.
The career civil servants who are inside the Department of Energy or the Department of Agriculture are highly exposed and scared.
Well, let's talk about the Department of Agriculture, which you spent some time in. And, a lot of people think of, that's the agency that distributes subsidies to farmers. And you found out there's an awful lot more that it does.
The USDA oversees firefighting in the country, wildfire fighting, and the National Forest Service and 200 million acres of national forest. The USDA funds a vast majority of the science research into food production. The USDA feeds poor people and school children who can't afford school lunches. The actual farming part of it, the agricultural part of it, the farm subsidy part of it, even if you count it generously, is less than 10% of the budget.
Who showed up from the Trump administration?
Well, I tell you, nobody showed up. The day after the election, nobody shows up.
Were they really expecting people the day after the election? Is that?
Oh, my God. They had parking spots reserved, and they had offices set aside, and the briefing books on the table, and it arranged Wi-Fi for the computers and passwords for everybody and, badges to get in and out of the buildings. They expected a team of people to show up. And this wasn't just the Department of Agriculture. There were other agencies where they were similarly prepared that just wondered, where is everybody? And then days passed, and they finally kind of get word that, well, they're a little disorganized and nobody's coming. And it was actually the better part of 2 months before anybody shows up who's going to represent Trump's transition to the Department of Agriculture. So they were just left waiting for a long time.
And the first person that shows up is a fellow named Brian Klippenstein, right?
The first guy who actually shows up and is still there is named Klippenstein, and he comes from an operation called Protect the Harvest. And Protect the Harvest, best as I can tell, it sees its job as essentially trolling the Humane Society. That it stands up for the rights of people in animal-people disputes, which, I didn't realize that it was necessary to do so. I thought people were doing a pretty good job of it, but it's hypersensitive to animal rights people and tries to respond to animal rights activists wherever it can. And the people in the USDA, of course, find that a little odd because one of the things the USDA does is stand up for the rights of animals in animal-people disputes.
They do dogfighting investigations. I happen to know
that kind of, yes, dogfighting in circuses and poultry farming and wherever animals might be mistreated, the USDA has some responsibility to monitor it. And anyway, so this guy, but he's a one-man transition team, and the thing that's bewildering to the people inside the USDA who thought they were going to be passing the baton and explaining to the Trump administration how the Department of Agriculture works is that they thought this is a job for 20 people to be done over 80 days, not one person over a couple of weeks. So the feeling generally inside the institution was that the transition never really happened, and the people who eventually come in never really got the briefings.
And so Klippenstein wasn't interested in details.
Well, according to my sources, he was interested in some things and not others, and he took a peculiar interest in anything having to do with climate change. He wanted to know who inside the agency had been responsible for responding to climate change. and this also happened in the Department of Energy. Essentially, there was a witch hunt across the government for scientists, policy people who were responsible for responding to climate change, because the position of the Trump administration was that basically it didn't exist. And so the career civil servant who was asked for the names of people in the Department of Agriculture who might be involved in, say, researching climate change, refused to give up names. So that got shut down right away.
Eventually, a larger team of Trump appointees did arrive at the Department of Agriculture. Who were they? What kind of backgrounds did they bring?
They sent in 30 or so people to work in the Department of Agriculture who were political appointees. They were typically young men in their 20s with absolutely no background in agriculture or in anything having to do with the mission of the Department of Agriculture. The magazine Politico got a hold of the resumes of these people, and most of them did not have the qualifications for the jobs they were supposed to hold. But the main positions inside the Department of Agriculture, the Senate-confirmed positions like the deputy secretary and the undersecretary's positions, there are 13 Senate-confirmed positions at the Department of Agriculture, and when I finished writing this piece a month ago, only one of them had been actually filled, the secretary.
You asked everybody, what's one of your biggest concerns about what might go awry here? And one of them said, the science. It turns out that the chief scientist of the Department of Agriculture is a Senate-confirmed position. You spoke to Kathy Wotecki, right? She was the previous chief scientist. What did she tell you about the job, what it does, why it's important?
So what she told me was in some ways even not as interesting as who she was. I mean, this is a person, she was 70 years old, who spent her entire career essentially preparing for this job of being the chief scientist of the Department of Agriculture and steering a budget of several $1 billion a year of grants to researchers who were working on things like how we respond to climate change in agriculture, how we grow crops in warmer climates or in different places, or how we graze livestock at higher altitudes. I mean, there are all kinds of research projects that are essentially laying the groundwork for how we feed ourselves 50 years from now, and that will pay off then. And it's mission critical. I mean, the whole department was, in fact, founded essentially as a science institution. When Lincoln created it in the 1860s, he did it so that farmers, there was a more rapid dissemination of the state-of-the-art practices in farming. So it's core to the mission of the Department of Agriculture. And this person who had been in the job, had spent 50 years training as an agricultural scientist and really understood the field. What concerned her was first who Trump had nominated to be her replacement, an Iowa right-wing talk show radio host named Sam Clovis, who had absolutely no background in science, whose chief qualification seems to have been he was just really loyal to Trump. He was co-chairman of Trump's campaign. And she, like everybody else, was mystified because while you can understand why political loyalists need to find their homes inside of an administration, why put him in a place where you actually have to know something? Why put him in charge of the science end of the Department of Agriculture, especially since so much of that research that's being done is one way or another related to climate change, and he doesn't think climate change exists. So the broader fear was that the science programs in the Department of Agriculture were going to be politicized, and that in a way they just hadn't been, and the culture would shift, and it would cease to be a scientific enterprise and become a political one.
When I read about this, it struck me that this is the kind of program that populists like Steve Bannon would say, this is exactly what we have to get rid of. This is the deep state, these bureaucrats who hand out tens of billions of dollars every year to obscure research projects or make loans to people hither and yon that taxpayers have no idea of or interest in. And this is the kind of swamp we want to drain. Give us an example of this science and the way it contributes something positive that we wouldn't know.
Penicillin. I mean, if you go back to the history of the Department of Agriculture and its role in making agriculture more efficient, there's not many people who would dispute that it has been the chief engine of agricultural progress in the country. from its founding. And the progress has been astonishing. I mean, the average farmer, when the Department of Agriculture is founded, is feeding 3 or 4 people a year, and now they're feeding 155 people a year. In some ways, the scientific progress in the production of food it underpins the entire economy. It enables everybody to be something else other than a farmer. So the idea that, like, the free market by itself is going to generate the optimum amount of long-term scientific research, I don't think any person who's actually in the market, like at a big corporation, a big ag corporation, or in the case of energy, big energy corporations, would say that there's any validity to that. It's that they know the market is very good at funding research that has obvious short-term gains that will yield. It's not so good at funding research that is going to have really long-term implications that are hard, the profits from which are hard to capture. And that's the kind of research that the department funds. And it funds it at, all those schools that are called ag or tech, the land-grant universities that were founded alongside the Department of Agriculture in the 1860s, are doing the research.
I want to come back to Sam Clovis, the guy that the Trump administration nominated as the chief scientist for the Department of Agriculture, who you say didn't have a background in science, was a talk show host. What do we know about his effect on the science program in the Department of Agriculture so far?
We know nothing yet. I mean, the question is, it's very hard to see what they're doing now. It's still early days. And the sad truth is that you could put someone who's wholly unqualified into that job, and the society wouldn't feel the effects for a very long time, because the kind of research that's being done is research that will pay off 30 years from now or 40 years from now. So this is, to me, there's a theme in the sort of risks that the Trump administration are taking by putting people who are not suited for jobs into the jobs. And one of the themes is that they're a willingness to tax the distant future for the political present, because the distant future really doesn't have a voice at the table.
I want to talk about the Energy Department. The Energy Department had reams of briefing material ready for the Trump team when they arrived. Who showed up, if anyone?
Nobody showed up the day after the election. They were expecting 20 to 30 people to roll in, and they were especially alarmed because like the Department of Agriculture, the Energy Department is misnamed. It really is misleading. You think it's about energy. It's really more about nuclear weapons. It's where the nuclear stockpile is maintained. And because they're in the middle of national security issues, and they were terrified that the Trump administration was not going to know what it needed to know. So they had 20 desks and 20 parking spots and so on and so forth, and nobody shows up for several weeks. And when someone shows up, again, it's one guy, and it's a guy who doesn't seem to know very much and doesn't seem actually all that interested in learning what they have to tell him. He shows up kind of in a spirit of, someone, they told me I kind of got to come in here. What became apparent to the Obama administration is that from the point of view of the Trump administration, the transition was something they just had to be able to say they did, but they didn't have any actual interest in. And now, it wasn't true in every department. I think it's probably less true, say, in the Defense Department, but that was generally true across the administration. And the problem is then, of course, what happens is there's no transfer of knowledge. I mean, the idea that, like, the people who are going out, even if they're from a different party, don't have anything to teach the people who are coming in is preposterous. That the vast majority of what I would tell you if I had been in the Energy Department for 8 years and you were coming in and didn't know very much about it would be not ideological at all. It would be like, how do we maintain the nuclear stockpile, or what's going on with a nuclear cleanup in eastern Washington, or it's a lot of very technical things. And I would also give you guidance on how the place runs. But the Trump administration clearly took the view that they had nothing to learn at all from the people who had been running the place for the last 8 years.
You write that there was what was called as a beachhead team, some group of Trump staffers who showed up. What did you hear that they did?
Well, the in the Energy Department, because this happened in every place. In the Energy Department, just to quote one of the civil servants, is they said they ran around insulting people. And they did, among other things, they asked for a list of all the names of people who had been involved in any climate change conferences or research. So there was a feeling that there was a witch hunt for people who had worked on climate change. Beyond that, there was no real groping with the subject matter or anything like that.
What about Rick Perry, the Energy Secretary, who once, as a candidate, I think, wanted to eliminate the Department of Energy?
Well, I wrote the piece on the Department of Energy and published it a couple of months ago. And one of the things that has occurred to me as I've been wandering around the government is that there's a distinction that needs to be made within the world of Trump appointees. And that there are a whole bunch of people like Sam Clovis in the Science Department at Agriculture, or like Rick Perry at Department of Energy, who have exhibited such ignorance of the task that they are been handed to do, that the responsible response to being asked to do it should have been, I'm not qualified. Rick Perry said on stage, call for the elimination of the Department of Energy, and I couldn't remember its name. So the feedback, what I got out of career civil servants is, one, it was an insult that he was even put in the job in the first place. Two, he wasn't making any great effort to actually get to know the place, though he was doing lots of public appearances. And seemed to view the job as largely a ceremonial job, where he would tour and tweet about it, tour a national laboratory, for example, and tweet about it, or there's been lots of foreign travel and tweeting about it, but no organic interaction with this department he's meant to run. Now, that may have changed since I wrote my piece. I don't know. But the fact that the people in the building who are serious, committed civil servants are offended by the person who's been put on top of them it's not a good sign.
Your article about the Energy Department is titled, "Why the Scariest Nuclear Threat May Be Coming from Inside the White House." What does the Energy Department do that should scare us if it's done badly?
Well, they make sure that nuclear weapons don't go off when they shouldn't, and that nuclear weapons do go off when we want them to.
Now, I would think that would be the Defense Department. What does the Energy Department have to do with it?
No. The Energy Department is responsible for maintaining the material inside of nuclear bombs, the plutonium and the uranium. It's research at national labs like Livermore Laboratory or Lawrence Berkeley Lab or Los Alamos that's funded by and overseen by the Department of Energy that maintains the nuclear stockpile. In addition, the Energy Department is charged with cleaning up the sites where we have made nuclear weapons, which are now horribly contaminated, and the more you learn about them, terrifying. So Hanford, Washington, Eastern Washington, was the site of the manufacture of the plutonium that went into the first atom bombs during World War II. And that was, of course, a hasty and rushed job. And we were racing to beat the Germans to get an atomic bomb. And a lot of stuff was dumped in the soil that should not have been dumped in the soil, and that is creeping slowly towards the Columbia River. And to clean it up, the Department of Energy estimates it's going to take $100 billion and 100 years. That site, which is like a third the size of Rhode Island, is a disaster waiting to happen. If it's not properly managed and the waste gets into the Columbia River, you have a nightmare scenario.
There are a lot of scientists and technical people, I'm sure, who run these, and the salt beds in New Mexico where the barrels of spent nuclear fuel are stored. But those at the top, what harm might they do? Are they going to cut the budget in ways that would have an impact?
It's hard to know what they're going to do. What we know is that the person who was actually in the office, who was in charge of overseeing the nuclear stockpile, during the last days of the Obama administration, heard no word at all from the Trump administration about who was going to replace him or whether they wanted him to stay on, to the point where he had packed up his boxes and left, and there was no one in the office until the Trump people called and said, but senators called the Trump administration and said, you got to get that guy back. What happens if there's no one actually kind of running the place in a competent way? I mean, you tell me. I mean, I don't think anybody knows. Here's something that one of the Energy Department officials said to me that it was just a throwaway line, but it stuck in my head. It said when when the Trump people finally showed up and were questioning the people who were in this department that oversees the nuclear arsenal, they were asking about where the weapons scientists came from who were in the various laboratories like Los Alamos. And they had explained to them that these people who end up figuring out how to make plutonium explode when you want it to explode and not explode when you don't want it to explode, these people didn't start their lives wanting to make atom bombs. You know, they didn't start their lives as weapons scientists. They started their lives as physicists, and they got interested in this complicated problem. And so they are housed in a place where there's lots of other kinds of science going on, and they get kind of drawn into the weapons program. And the response of the Trump people was, "Oh, that's dumb. Don't you want people who grew up wanting to make nuclear weapons?" And the answer was, well, actually, no, you don't want the person who grew up wanting to make nuclear weapons in the middle of this process, because God knows what they'll do.
You want people who won't know how to keep nuclear material safe.
Safe, exactly. So it's that kind of thing. Like, you know, if you let the wrong kind of people close to the process, it's hard to know how it will go wrong. You just know it's not going to go more right.
One of the things that struck me when you were writing about things that the Energy Department does that aren't apparent to anybody in the public is things like, for example, its contribution to containing Iran's nuclear program in ways. Can you want to just describe that for us?
Well, Obama's Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, is a nuclear physicist. He really knows how to build an atom bomb and what you need for it. So he was at the table during the Iran negotiations, and he was so pleased with the result of the negotiations because he knew that what they were being denied, or what they agreed to deny themselves, would deny them the nuclear capability. And that was the whole goal of the negotiation. So the Energy Department and the expertise in it is what you need at the table when you're trying to prevent some foreign country from getting its hands on nuclear weapons.
So if a new presidential administration comes in that is suspicious of the agreement, they need to understand the technical details to know whether it's an effective agreement or not, which means they got to pay attention and listen to the people in the department, right?
Absolutely. If you can't just say that's a bad deal without sitting down with people at like Los Alamos, who will explain to you why it's not a bad deal, while in fact this is going to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons.
Well, Michael Lewis, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Michael Lewis's articles about how the Trump administration is changing the federal government on the ground level are published in Vanity Fair. His book, The Undoing Project, is out in paperback. He spoke with Fresh Air's Dave Davies, who is also WHYY's senior reporter.